Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of love, loss, and redemption. Enjoy the story. Jake Thompson woke up with a pounding headache, the sunlight streaming through the curtains, feeling like daggers in his eyes. As he slowly regained consciousness, he became aware of a warm body next to him. For a moment he panicked, thinking he'd somehow overslept and missed his own wedding. But as he turned to look at the woman beside him, he realized it wasn't his fiancée, Sarah. It was Giselle. Giselle, the supermodel he'd met just yesterday at a small bistro downtown. Giselle, with her impossibly long legs and piercing green eyes. Giselle, who was most definitely not the woman he was supposed to marry in 3 days. Oh God, Jake groaned, sitting up and running his hands through his hair. What had he done? Giselle stirred, stretching like a cat before opening her eyes. "Morning, handsome," she purred. "Coffee?" Jake stumbled out of bed, grabbing his robe. "Yeah, I'll get it. Just stay there." As he fumbled with the coffee maker in his kitchen, Jake's mind raced. How had this happened? He'd just gone out for a quick bite after a long day of wedding preparations. Sarah had been pushing for a small ceremony, but Jake had insisted on going all out. "You don't understand," he'd told her. "This is a huge opportunity for us. We can invite all the right people, make connections that'll be invaluable for the business." Sarah had sighed, looking tired. "Fine, do whatever you think is best." Jake had felt a twinge of guilt at her resigned tone, but he'd pushed it aside. This was for their future, after all. Now, as he carried 2 steaming mugs back to the bedroom, Jake wondered if he'd just thrown that future away. Giselle was sitting up in bed, the sheet barely covering her. Jake averted his eyes, handing her the coffee. "So," Giselle said, taking a sip. "Last night was fun. What's next?" Jake nearly choked on his coffee. "Next? Giselle, I'm engaged. I'm getting married in 3 days. Last night was a mistake." Giselle's eyes narrowed. "A mistake? Honey, I don't make mistakes, and neither do you from what I saw last night." Jake felt his face flush. "That's not what I meant. I can't do this. I love Sarah." Giselle laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "Love? Oh, sweetie. Love is for poor people and losers who can't afford nice things for their partners. What matters is compatibility, ambition, and chemistry." She gave him a sultry look. "And we've got plenty of that, don't we?" Jake found himself nodding before he could stop himself. Giselle was right in a way. Things with Sarah had been comfortable. But was comfortable enough? "Look," Giselle said, setting down her coffee. "I'm not asking for a ring, but why settle for less than you deserve? You're young, successful, handsome. You could have it all." Jake's head was spinning. I need to think." Giselle slipped out of bed, not bothering with modesty. "Think fast, Jake. Opportunities like me don't come along every day." As she sauntered to the bathroom, Jake felt his resolve crumbling. Maybe, just maybe, Giselle was right. Maybe he deserved more than just comfortable. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of champagne, designer clothes, and Giselle's intoxicating presence. Jake found himself swept up in a world of glamour and excess he'd only dreamed of. By the time he surfaced, it was the night before his wedding to Sarah. His phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from Sarah, his family, the wedding planner. Jake had ignored them all, lost in the whirlwind that was Giselle. Now, sitting in his empty apartment, Giselle had gone out with friends. Jake finally picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over Sarah's name for a long moment before he hit call. Sarah answered on the first ring. "Jake? Oh my God, where have you been? I've been so worried." The concern in her voice made Jake's stomach churn with guilt. "Sarah, we need to talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was small. "You're calling off the wedding, aren't you?" Jake took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I met someone else. I can't go through with it." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake waited for the tears, the screaming, the accusations. But when Sarah finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm. "I see. Well, thank you for telling me before I walked down the aisle, I suppose. Goodbye, Jake." The line went dead before Jake could respond. He stared at his phone, feeling a mix of relief and unease. That had been too easy. But as Giselle burst through the door, arms laden with shopping bags and a bottle of champagne, Jake pushed his doubts aside. This was his new life now, and he was going to embrace it. Jake and Giselle's wedding was everything his planned ceremony with Sarah wasn't. Loud, extravagant, and plastered all over social media. Jake spared no expense, determined to give Giselle the lavish affair she deserved. As they exchanged vows in front of a crowd of beautiful strangers, most of whom Jake had never met before, he caught sight of his parents in the back row. His mother was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, but Jake couldn't tell if they were tears of joy or disappointment. The reception was a blur of champagne, dancing, and Giselle's dazzling smile. As they cut the cake, a 7-tier monstrosity that cost more than Jake's first car, Giselle leaned in close. "See?" she whispered. "This is the life you were meant for. Aren't you glad you didn't settle?" Jake nodded, pushing down the small voice in the back of his mind that whispered, "But at what cost?" The honeymoon was a whirlwind tour of exotic locales, each more expensive than the last. Jake's credit card took a beating, but he told himself it was worth it to see Giselle's eyes light up at each new luxury. But as the weeks turned into months, Jake began to notice cracks in their fairy tale romance. Giselle's expensive tastes weren't limited to vacations and clothes. She expected lavish gifts for every occasion, and some she seemed to invent on the spot. When Jake tried to gently suggest they cut back, Giselle's eyes would narrow dangerously. "What kind of man can't provide for his wife?" she'd snap. "If you can't handle it, maybe I should find someone who can." Jake would back down, not wanting to risk losing the trophy wife he'd sacrificed so much for. But as he dipped deeper and deeper into his company's funds to finance Giselle's lifestyle, he knew something had to give. It was a Tuesday evening when Jake's carefully constructed world came crashing down. He'd been working late again, desperately trying to salvage what was left of his once thriving business. As he trudged up the stairs to their penthouse apartment, he steeled himself for another night of Giselle's cold shoulder and cutting remarks. But when he opened the door, the apartment was dark and silent. "Giselle?" he called out, flicking on the lights. No answer. Jake made his way to the bedroom, a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. The room was empty, the closet doors flung wide open. Giselle's designer clothes and shoes were gone, leaving behind only empty hangers and a faint trace of her perfume. On the bed, Jake found a note scrawled on monogrammed stationery. "Jake, sorry darling, but this isn't working out. I need a man who can keep up with my lifestyle, not a boy playing at being rich. Don't try to find me. By the time you read this, I'll be long gone. Thanks for the memories and the diamonds, Giselle." Jake sank onto the bed, his head spinning. How had it come to this? He'd given up everything for Giselle, his fiancée, his reputation, his business. And now she was gone, leaving him with nothing but debt and regret. As the reality of his situation sank in, Jake's phone buzzed with a text. It was from his accountant. "We need to talk. The bank is calling in our loans. All of them. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late." Jake stared at the message, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. This was it, the end of everything he'd worked for. As he looked around the empty apartment, Jake's eyes fell on a framed photo from his wedding to Giselle. They looked so happy, so perfect. But it had all been a lie. For the first time since that fateful night he'd met Giselle, Jake allowed himself to think of Sarah. Sweet, practical Sarah, who had loved him for who he was, not what he could buy her. Sarah, who he'd tossed aside like yesterday's news for a glamorous illusion. With shaking hands, Jake picked up his phone and scrolled to Sarah's number. He hesitated for a moment, then hit call. It went straight to voicemail. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need help. I've made a terrible mistake. Please, if you get this, call me back. I'm sorry for everything." As he ended the call, Jake wondered if it was too late to make things right. Had he burned all his bridges in pursuit of a dream that turned out to be a nightmare? Little did Jake know his troubles were only just beginning. The next morning, Jake dragged himself to his company's offices, dreading the meeting with his accountant. But as he approached the conference room, he was met with an unexpected sight. Sitting at the head of the table was not his mild-mannered accountant, but a face he hadn't seen in months, Timothy Davis, Sarah's father. "Well, well," Timothy said, his voice cold. "Look what the cat dragged in." Jake felt his knees go weak. "Mr. Davis? What are you doing here?" Timothy leaned back in his chair, a predatory smile on his face. "Oh, didn't you hear? I own this bank now, and by extension, I own you." Jake's mind raced. He knew Timothy had been successful, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. "I don't understand," he stammered. "Let me spell it out for you, son," Timothy said, his voice dripping with sarcasm on the last word. "You took out loans, big loans, and now it's time to pay up. All of it. Today." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "But that's impossible! The terms! The contract!" Timothy slid a document across the table. "Read it again, Jake. Carefully this time." With trembling hands, Jake picked up the contract. There, in black and white, was a clause he'd somehow missed in his haste to get the money. "The lender reserves the right to call in the full amount of the loan at any time, at their discretion." Jake looked up, his eyes wide with panic. This will ruin me." Timothy's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's the idea, Jake. You ruined my little girl's life. Now it's my turn." As the reality of his situation sank in, Jake felt his world crumbling around him. In the span of 24 hours, he'd lost his wife, his business, and now, it seemed, his future. "Please," Jake begged, hating the desperation in his voice. "There must be something we can work out." "I'll do anything." Timothy stood, straightening his expensive suit. "It's too late for that, Jake. You made your choice. Now you get to live with the consequences." As Timothy walked out, leaving Jake alone in the conference room, the full weight of his actions came crashing down on him. He'd thrown away a good woman, a promising future, all for a fleeting taste of glamour and excitement. And now he was left with nothing but regret and a mountain of debt. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, asset liquidations, and sleepless nights. Jake watched helplessly as everything he'd built was stripped away, piece by piece. His company, his home, even his car, all gone to satisfy the debts he'd racked up. He ended up in a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of town, surviving on ramen noodles and whatever odd jobs he could scrounge up. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd left Sarah because he thought he deserved more, and now he had less than he'd ever had before. One particularly bleak evening, as Jake sat on his threadbare couch, staring at the wall and wondering how it had all gone so wrong, there was a knock at the door. Puzzled, he never had visitors these days. Jake answered. His jaw dropped when he saw who was standing there. Sarah? She looked different, more confident, more polished, but her eyes still held that same warmth he remembered. "Hello, Jake," she said softly. "May I come in?" Wordlessly, Jake stepped aside, acutely aware of how far he'd fallen. Sarah took in the sparse apartment with a quick glance but said nothing. "Why are you here?" Jake finally managed to ask. Sarah sat on the couch, smoothing her skirt. "I got your voicemail. It took me a while to decide whether I wanted to respond." Jake felt a flicker of hope. "And?" Sarah met his eyes. "And I wanted to see for myself if you'd really changed, if you'd learned anything from all this." Jake sank into the chair across from her. "Oh, I've learned plenty, but it's too late now, isn't it? I've lost everything. My business, my money, you." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "Actually, that's not entirely true." Jake looked at her, confused. Sarah opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. "Your company isn't gone, Jake. It's mine now." "What?" Jake felt like he'd been punched in the gut. You bought my company?" Sarah nodded. "With a little help from my father, yes. He wanted to dismantle it completely, but I convinced him to let me take it over instead." Jake's head was spinning. "But why? After what I did to you?" Sarah's eyes flashed with a mix of emotions, hurt, anger, but also something else. Compassion, maybe? "Because despite everything, I know you're not a bad person, Jake. You just lost your way for a while." She stood up, smoothing her skirt again. "I'm offering you a job, not as CEO, of course, but an entry-level position, a chance to work your way up again, the right way this time. Jake stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. Sarah, I don't know what to say. Sarah headed for the door. You don't have to say anything now. Think about it. If you want the job, be at the office Monday morning 9 a.m. sharp. As she reached for the doorknob, Jake found his voice. Sarah, wait. She turned, one eyebrow raised. I'm sorry, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, for everything. I was a fool, and I hurt you terribly. I don't deserve this second chance. Sarah's expression softened slightly. Maybe not, but you're getting it anyway. What you do with it is up to you. And with that, she was gone, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and an unexpected glimmer of hope for the future. 1 year later. Jake straightened his tie as he waited for the elevator in the lobby of what used to be his company. A year had passed since Sarah had offered him that lifeline, and he'd worked every day to prove he deserved it. Starting in the mailroom had been a humbling experience, but it had taught Jake more about his former company and himself than he'd ever known as CEO. He'd worked his way up to a junior account manager position, earning every promotion through hard work and dedication. As he stepped into the elevator, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirrored walls. Gone was the flashy suit and arrogant smirk. In their place was a man who looked content, grounded. The doors opened on the executive floor, and Jake made his way to Sarah's office. They had a standing weekly meeting to discuss ongoing projects, but today felt different somehow. Sarah looked up as he entered, a small smile playing on her lips. Good morning, Jake. Please have a seat. Jake sat down, feeling a familiar flutter in his stomach. Despite their professional relationship over the past year, he couldn't deny that his feelings for Sarah had only grown stronger, but he'd kept things strictly professional, not wanting to jeopardize the second chance she'd given him. So, Sarah began, leaning back in her chair, it's been a year since you started here. How do you think it's going? Jake took a deep breath. Honestly, it's been the most challenging and rewarding year of my life. I've learned so much, not just about the business, but about myself. I can't thank you enough for the opportunity, Sarah. Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. And do you think you've changed? Grown from the experience? Jake met her gaze steadily. I know I have. The man I was before? I barely recognize him now. I was so caught up in appearances and status that I lost sight of what really mattered. I hurt a lot of people, especially you, and I'll always regret that. But this year has taught me the value of hard work, integrity, and true connection. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying him. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a file. I'm glad to hear you say that, Jake, because I have a proposition for you. Jake leaned forward, curious. Sarah opened the file and slid it across the desk to him. I'm offering you a promotion, senior account manager, with the potential to move up to VP in the next year if you continue to perform well. Jake's eyes widened as he scanned the document. The salary and benefits package was impressive, more than he'd been making even as CEO before everything fell apart. But it wasn't the money that made his heart race. Sarah, I don't know what to say. Are you sure? Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes that made Jake's breath catch. I'm sure. You've more than earned it, Jake. You've shown real growth and commitment this past year. The board agrees. You're ready for more responsibility. Jake felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Thank you, Sarah. I promise I won't let you down. Sarah's smile faltered slightly, and she looked down at her hands. There's one more thing, Jake. Jake felt a flicker of anxiety. Oh? Sarah took a deep breath, then met his eyes. This past year, working closely with you, it's brought back a lot of feelings I thought I'd buried. I've tried to keep things professional, but I can't deny it anymore. I still have feelings for you, Jake. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. Sarah, I feel the same way. I have for a long time, but I didn't want to complicate things or make you uncomfortable. Sarah reached across the desk, taking his hand. I think we've both grown a lot in the past year. Maybe we could try again? Take things slow, see where it leads? Jake squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of hope and happiness he hadn't experienced in years. I'd like that very much, Sarah. As they smiled at each other, the intercom on Sarah's desk buzzed. "Miss Davis? Your father is here to see you." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Send him in, please." Jake felt a jolt of nervousness as Timothy Davis strode into the office, his imposing presence filling the room. Timothy's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him, Jake and Sarah, hands still clasped across the desk. "Well," Timothy said, his voice carefully neutral, "what's going on here?" Sarah stood, her chin lifted defiantly. "Dad, Jake and I were just discussing his promotion to senior account manager, and we've decided to give our relationship another chance." Timothy's eyebrows shot up. He looked at Jake, his gaze piercing. "Is that so? And what do you have to say about this, Jake?" Jake stood as well, facing Timothy squarely. "Mr. Davis, I know I hurt Sarah terribly in the past. I made a lot of mistakes, and I've spent the last year trying to make amends and become a better man. I love your daughter, sir, and if she's willing to give me another chance, I promise to spend every day proving that I'm worthy of her trust and affection." Timothy was quiet for a long moment, looking between Jake and Sarah. Finally, he sighed. "Well, I can't say I'm thrilled about this, but," he added, seeing Sarah's expression harden, "I trust my daughter's judgment. And I have to admit, Jake, you've shown real character this past year. Just remember, you're on probation with me, young man. Don't mess this up again." Jake nodded solemnly. "I understand, sir, and thank you." As Timothy left the office, Sarah turned to Jake, her eyes shining. "Well, that went better than I expected." Jake laughed, pulling her into a hug. "I think that's the nicest thing your father's ever said to me." Sarah leaned back, looking up at him with a mix of love and determination. "We've got a long road ahead of us, Jake. It won't always be easy." Jake nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know, but we've both learned a lot, and this time, we'll face whatever comes together." As they sealed their new beginning with a kiss, Jake marveled at how different his life was from a year ago. He'd lost everything, only to gain something far more precious: true love, hard-won wisdom, and a chance at real happiness. The road ahead might be challenging, but with Sarah by his side, Jake knew he could face anything. He'd been given a second chance at love and life, and this time, he was determined to get it right.